The operations director's voice came through the radio at 2:14 in the morning, flat and certain, the way it always was when she had already decided something before she said it. "Reade, step away from that man or clear out your locker tonight." Oliver Reade did not step away. He kept his hand on the old man's elbow, steady and unhurried, and he walked him through the sliding doors of Lakeview Private Medical Center, while the overnight receptionist watched from behind her desk, and the duty nurse found something important to look at on the floor, and the radio on Oliver's belt went quiet the way a room goes quiet when a thing has already been decided. He did not know the man's name. He would not know it for 9 weeks. Lakeview Private Medical Center sat on the edge of the escarpment in Hamilton, Ontario, with a view of the lower city that the marketing brochures always described as panoramic, and that Oliver, who had worked the overnight shift for 4 years, would have described as something to look at during the long stretches when the waiting room was empty. The hospital was not public. It operated on a model that the administrator liked to call premium integrated care, and that most of the staff understood to mean private insurance or private payment, and the lobby showed it. Cream tile, real plants, a reception desk that looked more like a hotel check-in than a triage counter, the kind of facility where the parking lot had charging stations, and the waiting area offered 2 kinds of coffee, and nobody came in off the street at 2 in the morning, looking the way the old man had looked. Oliver Reade was 48 years old, and he had been doing security work for 11 years. He was broad-shouldered, a little gray at the temples, and he wore the company uniform in the manner of someone who had stopped thinking about it. He was not the kind of man who described himself to people, and the people who knew him at Lakeview mostly knew him through the things he did rather than anything he said about himself. He arrived early. He covered the shifts nobody else wanted, because someone had to. When a confused elderly patient wandered toward the wrong exit at midnight, Oliver was the one who found them and walked them back without making it into a story. When the vending machine by the 3rd-floor lounge broke and left the night shift nurse without her coffee, he drove to the Tim Hortons on Main Street on his break and came back with a cup for her and said nothing about it. He had a daughter, Bryn, who was 16 and lived with him in a 2-bedroom rental on the east side of the mountain. His wife, Deirdre, had died of an aneurysm 4 years earlier. It had been very fast, which people said was a mercy, and Oliver had learned that fast and merciful were not the same thing, but that there was no point in arguing about it. He had come out the other side of that year alone, with a mortgage he couldn't keep, and a daughter who needed consistency more than she needed the house. And he had made the trade without complaining about it, because complaining didn't pay the rent on the 1st of the month. He did not talk about any of this at work. He had his locker and his radio and his chair by the front desk, and he knew the names of every overnight staff member, and he remembered that Petra Vance, the overnight receptionist, took her tea without sugar, and that the duty nurse always ran cold in winter, and that the heating vent above her station had barely worked since September. Colette Hawkins had been operations director at Lakeview for 5 years. She was in her mid-40s, and she ran the facility the way a person runs something they intend to be promoted out of within the next 2 years, with constant attention to the numbers that went into the quarterly report and a corresponding indifference to everything that didn't. Patient satisfaction scores mattered to her insofar as they appeared on the dashboard. Admission turnaround mattered. Bed occupancy by insurance tier mattered considerably more than she was willing to say out loud. What she said out loud and often was that Lakeview maintained its reputation by maintaining its standards, and that its standards were what its clients paid for, and that clients who could not pay were what the regional health authority was for. She did not say this unkindly. That was the particular thing about Colette Hawkins. She was never unkind about it. She stated it the way a policy is stated, without emotion, because emotion implies that someone considered doing it differently. She used Oliver because Oliver could be used. He didn't make trouble. He had worked the overnight 4 years without asking for the position change that would have come with a raise, without making noise about the break room refrigerator management had been promising to replace since March. When the parking lot lights failed on the west side, he borrowed a contractor's reflective vest from his own car and stood out there 3 hours until maintenance arrived, and she had seen this on the camera feed and done nothing with it. She did not yell at him. That was not her style. She managed him with a flatness that was almost worse, the kind of tone that implies a person is barely worth the temperature it would take to be angry at them. The man came through the ambulance bay entrance at 2:09 in the morning on a Thursday in February, which was wrong in the first place. The ambulance bay was for ambulances, not walk-ins, and he was wearing a jacket that had been good once, and a pair of rubber-soled boots that had left wet prints on the cream tile, all the way from the sliding doors to the reception desk. He was somewhere in his mid-60s. Compact frame, careful posture, the kind of man who moved like he was used to moving around other people's things. He had a toque pulled low, and he was holding his left arm against his side in a way that Oliver had been trained to recognize. Oliver had seen a lot of people come through those doors. He knew the difference between a man who was cold and a man who was in pain. The man reached Petra's desk and told her in a quiet, unhurried voice that he was having some chest pain and that it had been going on for about 40 minutes and that he thought he ought to get it looked at. He spoke the way a person speaks when they are trying very hard not to cause a fuss. Petra asked for his insurance card. The man said he was with OHIP. He did not have a private plan. He had never had one. He said this without embarrassment because it was simply a fact. Petra told him, very politely, that Lakeview was a private facility, and that without a valid private health plan or a deposit of $400, she was not able to admit him, and that Hamilton General was 12 minutes away and had a full emergency department, and that she would be happy to call him a cab. The man looked at her for a moment. He did not argue. He said he understood, and he turned around. He had taken 3 steps toward the exit when Oliver spoke. He asked him to wait, and the man stopped. Oliver told Petra quietly that the man was presenting with chest pain, symptomatic for 40 minutes, and that sending him out into a February night to wait for a cab was not something he was willing to watch happen. He asked her to page the on-call physician. Petra said she had her instructions. Oliver said he was aware of her instructions. The radio clicked. Colette's voice came through at a volume calibrated to be heard by both of them, and by the duty nurse and by the 2 other people in the overnight waiting room. "Reade, this is not a public car. Do not engage with walk-in patients who have not been admitted. Stand down." Oliver picked up the radio and said he was not going to do that. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. "That man has no coverage. He cannot be admitted. If you bring him through that desk, you're done here tonight and every other night. I am not asking you." Oliver looked at the old man, who was watching this exchange with an expression that was perfectly composed on the surface and something else entirely underneath. The expression of a person holding their dignity intact through something they should not have had to hold it intact through. He thought about his locker. His jacket was in it. His daughter's school photo was taped to the inside of the door. He put the radio on the desk. He walked around to the old man's side of the counter, put his hand under the man's elbow, and said they were going to get him seen right now and not to worry about anything else. He walked him through. Colette's voice came over the intercom this time, so it reached every room on the ground floor. "Oliver Reade, you are terminated effective immediately. Step away from that individual and leave the building." Oliver did not raise his voice. He turned his head slightly, the way you turn when you want one person to hear you clearly without performing it for everyone else. "He's been having chest pain for 40 minutes. I'll answer for whatever comes after." The duty nurse, to her credit, had already moved. By the time Oliver and the man reached the triage bay, she had a blood pressure cuff in her hands, and the on-call physician had been paged. The physician that night was Dr. Anisha Malhotra, and she came down in 4 minutes, which was faster than Oliver had expected, and exactly as fast as the situation warranted. She took one look at the man's presentation and had him on a monitor within 90 seconds. Oliver sat in the plastic chair outside the triage bay for an hour and 20 minutes, with his termination radio announced to every floor of the building and his badge still on his chest, and no particular plan about what to do next. A nurse came out at 3:40 and told him the man had experienced a cardiac event, a minor one, caught very early, and that he was stable and would be kept for observation. She said he had asked about the security guard. Oliver told her to let him know everything was fine and that she didn't need to say who had brought him in. The nurse looked at him for a moment. She said that was an unusual request. Oliver said he was aware of that, picked up his jacket, and walked out through the ambulance bay the same way the old man had come in. The first 2 weeks after were almost manageable. He had 11 years of experience and a clean record and references from 2 previous employers that had nothing to do with Lakeview, and he filed 4 applications in the first week and had 2 callbacks by the end of it. The interview at a corporate facility management company went well enough that the supervisor told him to expect a call about orientation. The call came 4 days later, and it was not from the supervisor. It was from someone in HR who said the position had been reassigned internally. He applied to 3 more places in the 3rd and 4th weeks: a university campus security office, a private residential complex, a transit authority contractor. Each one moved to the reference check stage and stopped. By the 5th week, he began to understand the shape of what was happening. A hiring coordinator at the transit contractor told him, plainly and without cruelty, that she had called his most recent employer as a matter of process and had been told that Oliver Reade had abandoned his post mid-shift, refused a direct order from his supervisor, and left the premises without completing his termination paperwork. Every word of it was technically true. Not one word of it contained what had actually happened. He stood in the parking lot of the transit office on a Tuesday in March and ran through it the way you run through a thing when you are being methodical about your own situation. Colette Hawkins had not lied to anyone. She had simply chosen which true things to say, and there was nothing he could do about it except tell a stranger that he had refused a direct order because an old man's heart was failing in a lobby, and company policy had a position on that. And out of his own mouth, in a stranger's office, that was going to sound like either an excuse or a lawsuit he couldn't afford. He did not pursue a lawsuit. He had looked at what it would cost him in time and money and probable outcome, and he had a daughter starting her last year of secondary school and a lease that came due on the 1st regardless of what had happened to him in February. The savings went the way savings go when a person is careful and still running out of options. He had 3 months of cushion, then 2, then the kind of arithmetic that comes out the same no matter which direction you approach it from. Bryn knew something was wrong because she was 16 and not unobservant, and she stopped asking for things she could see were not affordable without him having to say anything about it, and that was harder to deal with than the savings would have been. By the 8th week, he had stopped applying and started selling. The compound miter saw he had bought the year before Deirdre died, a generator he had used twice and kept telling himself he would need again. He kept a small notebook where he tracked everything. Not as evidence, just because keeping track was the thing that kept him from feeling entirely at the mercy of something he had no control over, when mostly he did not. He did not regret it. He turned the question over at his kitchen table at 11 o'clock one night, the arithmetic in front of him, and he asked himself plainly whether he would have done it differently if he had known what it would cost. And what he found, sitting there with the numbers, was that the answer was no. Not because it had been rewarded, it hadn't been, and he had no reason to think it ever would be. But because the alternative had been standing in a lit lobby at 2 in the morning, watching a 65-year-old man with chest pain walk back out into a February night while a policy was applied to him by someone who had never once in that building asked what happened to the people it was applied to. He had said out loud on the ground floor of Lakeview that he would answer for whatever came after. 8 weeks of unemployment had not made that untrue. The man who came to his door on a Wednesday evening in the 9th week was not the old man. He was younger, well-dressed in the way that people are well-dressed when they are not thinking about it, and he introduced himself as Nathaniel Galt and said he was looking for Oliver Reade. Oliver said he had found him. Nathaniel Galt said that his father's name was Kenneth Galt, that Kenneth had spent 5 days in Hamilton General following the cardiac event, caught early, he was careful to say, and doing well, and that his father had asked about the security guard every day since he had been admitted, and that it had taken Nathaniel's office 3 weeks to locate him because the Lakeview records listed the incident as an unauthorized admission and provided no name for the individual who had facilitated it. He said his father would like to speak with him. Oliver said he was glad the man was all right. He said he didn't need to meet him. Nathaniel looked at him quietly for a moment. He said he understood that, and he said that his father was going to keep asking regardless, and that there were things Oliver might want to know about what had happened in the 9 weeks since February, and that it might be worth an hour of his time. Oliver said he had a free schedule and went and got his jacket. Kenneth Galt lived in a house in Ancaster that from the outside looked like every other older house on the street. White siding, deep front porch, a 2-car garage with only 1 car in it. Oliver had looked up the name on the drive over, Galt Properties. He had been passing the signs on construction hoardings across the Hamilton-Halton region for 20 years without ever putting a face to them. Kenneth was in the kitchen when they arrived. Cardigan over a flannel shirt, a cup of tea on the table in front of him. The air of a man who had recently been through something, but who was not going to perform it. He stood when Oliver came in. He was shorter than Oliver remembered from the lobby. He said, "You're the one who walked me through." Oliver said he was. Kenneth poured him a cup of tea and told him to sit down, and then he said he had been trying to find the man who had walked him through since his second morning in Hamilton General, which was when he had reconstructed enough of it to understand what it had cost. He said, "I know about the termination. I know about the reference calls. Nathaniel's office has spoken with 3 of the employers who didn't hire you back, and 2 of them have confirmed in writing what I suspect you already worked out, that the account they received about your departure was accurate in its facts and dishonest in its meaning." Oliver said that he had figured that out on his own. Kenneth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have spent 65 years arranging my life so that people would deal with me as a person and not as a balance sheet. And in 4 minutes on a February night in your lobby, I found out exactly what that bought me when the wallet was empty." He said, "Everyone in that building made a calculation. The woman at the desk, the nurse, the voice on the radio. They looked at a man in a wet coat and made a calculation about what his time was worth. And then he looked at Oliver directly and said, 'You were the only one who didn't.' Oliver said, 'I didn't know who you were. I only knew you were in pain, and no one else was going to do anything about it.'" Kenneth looked at him for a long moment. He said, "That is exactly the point, and it is why we are sitting in this kitchen." Nathaniel had been thorough in the way that people are thorough when they have both resources and a reason. He had retained outside counsel the week after his father was discharged. He had obtained security footage from Lakeview under a formal legal request before anyone at the facility knew the request was coming, and the footage had been time-stamped and reviewed by the legal team before the hospital's management had been notified that a review was underway at all. 9 cameras, 3 with audio. What they showed was unambiguous: an old man asking for help, a receptionist following her instructions, a radio directive to leave him at the door, a security guard who had declined to follow it, and on a camera pointed at the second-floor monitoring station. Colette Hawkins watching the lobby feed at the time the transmission was made, her face entirely calm, the way a person's face is calm when they have made a policy decision rather than a human one. The incident report she had filed 40 minutes later logged the event as unauthorized admission facilitated by contract security personnel, resulting in disciplinary action and contract termination. Patient outcome not recorded, as patient was transferred to regional authority facility. There was no mention that the patient had presented with cardiac symptoms. There was no note of what Dr. Malhotra had found when she arrived. There was no record of the 40 minutes of chest pain that Oliver had written in a small notebook nobody had asked him to keep. Nathaniel's legal team sent the footage and the incident report to the college that licensed the facility, to the Provincial Health Authority, and to the board of the company that owned Lakeview's parent group. Then they contacted the parent group directly. Because Kenneth Galt had built his company over 4 decades by understanding which assets were undervalued, and Lakeview's parent group was undervalued in precisely the way that badly managed things tend to be cheap. Oliver was not there when it happened to Colette Hawkins. He heard about it afterward from the duty nurse, who sent him a message through the contact number Nathaniel's office had used, because she had his number now and she wanted him to know. 2 people from the parent group's legal team had arrived at the facility on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, with a representative from the provincial licensing office. Colette had been in her office reviewing the quarterly report. She had been asked to attend a meeting in the boardroom with documentation relating to the February incident. She had brought the quarterly report. She had brought the 5-year performance summary she kept on her computer in a folder labeled, simply, Achievements. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. The legal team had the footage. They had the incident report. They had Dr. Malhotra's admitting notes from that night. They had affidavits from 2 employers describing the reference account they had received about a former contract employee. Colette's employment was terminated for conduct constituting a breach of the facility's duty of care standards, falsification of patient intake records, and employer interference with the post-termination employment of a former contractor. The nurse wrote that Colette had walked out of the boardroom still holding the quarterly report and had asked the receptionist to call her a cab. Petra Vance had called it without a word. The nurse also wrote that she was sorry she had looked at her shoes. She said it in exactly those words. She said she had thought about it every day since February. Oliver wrote back and said he understood. He said it because he did understand. He had spent 4 years working nights in that building, and he knew exactly what it cost to say something out loud when the person with the authority was on the other end of the radio. He said that what she had done, paging Dr. Malhotra the moment he walked Kenneth through, moving when it mattered, was the thing that had saved the man's life, and that was worth more than anything she had looked away from. A week after the settlement was signed, Kenneth called him. Not Nathaniel. Kenneth himself on a Thursday afternoon. He said he had a proposal and that he wanted to make it plainly and let Oliver decide without pressure attached to it. He said that the parent group had completed its acquisition of Lakeview and 4 other facilities in the network, and that the new ownership had appointed an interim operations board, and that the board had identified a need for someone to develop patient experience standards across the network. Not a clinical role, a standards role. Someone who understood what it was like to stand on a facility floor at 2 in the morning when a policy was being applied to a human being. He said he had not found a better candidate in the organization. Oliver was quiet for a moment. He said he had no interest in being anyone's lesson. If he took the position because he happened to be standing in the right lobby on the right night, then every person in those facilities would learn that decency pays off when you are lucky. And he had spent 9 weeks understanding what it looked like when it didn't. That was not a standard worth building. Kenneth was quiet on his end of the line for 4 seconds. Then he said, "That argument is exactly the one I want written into the policy." Oliver accepted with one condition. He stated it as a condition rather than a request, because he had learned something about that distinction over the past 9 months. The standard had to cover every employee across all 5 facilities, not administrators alone, not just clinical staff, overnight reception, parking attendants, security contractors, every person who came into contact with a patient or a visitor, and it had to rest on one principle, that a person's access to care could not vary based on what they wore or what they carried or what name appeared on their insurance card. The 3 who had been terminated were gone, and that was that. But there were others who had been in that lobby in February and said nothing, and dismissing them would teach nobody anything. They needed to be trained and kept. The silence was the actual problem, and silence was something you could address, if you were willing to be honest about why it happened. Kenneth agreed before Oliver finished. He started the following Monday. The first thing he did was drive to Hamilton General and find Kenneth's cardiologist and ask her, plainly, what the outcome would have been if a 65-year-old man in a wet coat had waited 14 minutes in a February night with 40 minutes of symptoms already behind him. She told him clearly. He wrote it in the same small notebook. He built the standard over 6 weeks, sitting with frontline staff across all 5 facilities, not from a boardroom but from the overnight security chair, from the reception desk, from the break room where the heating vent barely worked. The measurement framework changed first, because he had learned in 11 years on the floor that people move toward what gets counted. Patient outcome documentation went above admission turnaround. A manager who cleared the lobby in 20 minutes and sent 2 patients in the wrong direction no longer looked good on the new report. Once that was true, the behavior started changing on its own. He never showed anyone the footage. He was asked to more than once, by trainers who thought it would be powerful, by administrators who thought it would be cautionary. He declined every time. Kenneth Galt had spent 65 years living quietly, and he had been reduced to a wet toque on a cream tile floor, and Oliver was not going to put that in front of a room full of strangers to make a point. He described what had happened instead, in the order it happened, without embellishment, and it turned out to be sufficient. The duty nurse attended the first session. She sat in the third row and asked the one question nobody else asked, which was, what should she have done differently that night? Oliver gave her the honest answer. One person saying something out loud at that reception desk would have changed everything, and it was easier to say something out loud when you understood in advance that it was the kind of thing worth saying. That was the reason they were all sitting there. The quarterly report came in a few months later. The Lakeview facility had the highest patient experience score in the network. The report noted the improvement without explaining it. Oliver read it at a desk he had not asked for and did not think much of the number, because he had been in the building enough by then to know what it looked like on the floor. A receptionist reading the fine print on a coverage form out loud for someone who couldn't see it clearly. A security guard holding the door open longer than the sensor required. A line that moved a little slower and generated considerably fewer complaints. Kenneth Galt still drove himself to the grocery store and to the pharmacy, and to the restaurant on Concession Street he had been going to since before his wife died. He wore the same cardigans and carried nothing that announced what he owned, because he had made that choice 40 years ago and saw no reason to revisit it. He let Nathaniel drive on longer trips now, which he described as temporary, and which Nathaniel understood to be permanent and said nothing about. Oliver understood by then what had actually changed his life, not the arrival of 4 black SUVs and a legal team, not the particular identity of the man who had come through the ambulance bay doors. Those were the accident, the specific, unrepeatable circumstance of who had walked through that door on that particular night. What had changed everything was a decision made in about 30 seconds at 2:14 in the morning, with a policy being read to him through a radio and a stranger going gray in front of him. The decision to not walk away, made with no knowledge of who the man was, made with no expectation of what would follow. He had told Kenneth in that kitchen in Ancaster that he hadn't known who he was. He still meant it. He would always mean it. It was the only thing from that night he was entirely certain of. That it hadn't mattered. That it still didn't. That the measure of a person was not what they carried in their wallet, or what name appeared on their record, or what calculation the room made when they walked through the door. He had learned that at a reception desk at 2 in the morning, and he had spent the following year writing it into a standard that would outlast him across 5 facilities in the province, in a small office with a window facing a parking lot where no one would have recognized his name. That had always been enough. It still was.